Hey everyone, I'm Dan Deppen, and in this one, I'm going to talk about some of my reflections on my first year that I spent in note investing, both learning about notes and starting to get up to speed, and then turning into an active note investor. Before I get to that, I want to talk about the virtual workshop that we've got coming up from March 8th to 10th. It's a note investing virtual workshop, lots of exciting stuff in there. Really everything A to Z on notes, going everywhere from where to buy notes, due diligence, filtering. Got some special guest speakers. So they're going to talk about seller finance, where to find vendors, uh, even sub two and creative finance. So lots of different things included. And so it's going to be 3 days of events. And if you can't make it March 8th to 10th, all the recordings are included with all the tickets. So this workshop is really good for people who maybe kind of like I was in 2017 and 18, like kind of like the phase of my career that I'm about to talk about here in a minute, where you've discovered notes as a niche. It's interesting. You're at the point where you're like, okay, I want to learn more. I want to take that next step, not necessarily go to like a full blown expensive training program. But it also a lot of valuable stuff in there for people who've maybe already started and bought a few notes, but want to actually go a little bit deeper. So early bird pricing is available for $299 through the end of February. Then it goes back up to $399. So you can check the link to that in the description or go to fusionnotes.com/virtual workshop. So great way for you to get started in notes. But now getting to this. So recently, well, let me back up already. I've always done a lot of journaling. I take notes on different things that are going on in my life, whether it's like work or business or health and fitness, all kinds of different things. And, these days I primarily use just Google Docs for all that stuff. But at one point I was keeping a lot of stuff in a application called Evernote. And Evernote was always free. And now they've gone to this thing where they want you to pay, and you can still use it for free, but it's kind of a pain. And so I started migrating all my old stuff that I had in Evernote over into Google Docs. And in the midst of doing that, going through some really old stuff, like some of these documents went back actually 10 years, but I came across a bunch of note files that I had from 2017 and 2018 when I had first discovered notes and were getting involved. Um, and so for me, basically, I discovered notes in early 2017, started going down the rabbit hole, and then started getting involved in deals at the end of 2017. And then 2018, I started scaling up. And so I'm going to talk about some of the sources of info that I had back then, some of the events I attended to learn more, the people that I was influenced by. And a lot of this stuff was really fascinating to me going back because there were a lot of details in there that I had completely forgotten about. So some of the advice I was given, actually surprisingly large amount of the advice I was given was, pretty dead spot on and really valuable. There was also some advice in there I'll talk about that was just complete hot garbage. There were also people I was listening to and kind of influenced by, some of whom are still in the business. And now I'm close to, actually, some of them are speaking at the virtual workshop that's coming up. And some of them turned out to be bad actors. So really for me, like a lot of interesting stuff to go down memory lane and see what I learned. So hopefully I can save you some trouble here. If you're going through that same process, maybe you're finding some of the same resources and people, I can try to tell you what some of the good and the bad are as someone who's gone from just starting out to buying well over 100 notes. One of the interesting resources I read was a webinar that Dave Putz did in November of 2017 on partials, where he had Dan Zatofsky on. And there was a lot of great advice in this one. So they talked about the risk of buying low cost notes or notes on low value properties or low BPO. Basically what happens here is sometimes when people start in notes, they're kind of tempted to try to find a note that's the cheapest one because they want to go into it without spending as much capital. The risk with the challenge with that is a lot of your lower cost notes or your notes on really lower cost properties are much higher risk. And so generally there's enough risk in notes to begin with. you really don't want to mess with that. Those kind of deals have the potential often to have, if it's still the note, expensive problems to work out, to either take it through legal or your low BPO properties. If you do end up taking that property back, it can be really tough to work on, right? So if it's a low BPO property in a rough neighborhood and you get the property back and it's beat down, it might cost you more to try to rehab that thing than other properties on the street are worth. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense. The other thing that Dan Zatofsky talked about that I really took to heart and still do to this day is he said that he doesn't like to buy notes on properties he's not willing to own. Now, that's not everybody's model. There's a lot of people out there who will buy a non-performing note, try to work it out, and if they can't, just turn around and resell the note, or basically won't foreclose and take the property back. I really adopted Dan's philosophy here, and I feel like it served me pretty well because I've had about 6 or 7 deals at this point that I've been taking through foreclosure, got all the way up to the end, and borrowers made very large reinstatements. I'm talking about borrowers who were making $300-400 a month P&I payments, and then all of a sudden cough up a $5,000 to $8,000 reinstatement at the last minute. Actually, just about 2 weeks ago, had a borrower do that very thing. Apparently, the borrower had actually left the property for a few months, left abandoned cars on the property that I had to sell, and then somehow, some way, coughed up a $6,600 reinstatement. So I think Dan's idea of not buying notes on properties you're not willing to own, one, like it enforces a certain level of discipline when you're buying notes up front. And then two, it gives you the shot at those last minute reinstatements that you wouldn't get if you weren't willing to take the deal all the way the distance. Sorry. So in this one too, this particular webinar was especially around partials. And one of the other things I called out that I really agree with is if you start notes in partials, it's kind of an easier way to get in the game and start earning a little bit of passive income, right? And the other thing that's cool about it is you can spend less money on the deal and get a better property. So this kind of dovetails with their advice of staying away from low cost notes on low BPO properties, right? People do that because they don't want to start off by investing that much money. So if you buy a partial, you're buying the front end payments of a loan. That's a way to go into the deal with spending less money, but then also having a better property and better underlying loan. And this is one I had forgotten about. I've done a lot with partials since, but I hadn't actually thought about it in quite this way. So it was really interesting to go back through my notes and see that. Now, there was also some nonsense advice as well. And this was not from Dan and Dave. The nonsense advice, I'm not going to name names, but we'll call this guy bad actor number one. So this one guy had claimed he had like 500,000 investors in his database, and there are not 500,000 note investors like in the world. I've actually been trying to estimate that number myself. I think it's around 10, but that's super sketchy. There's maybe, from what I've been reading, like 2 million investors in other properties like single family rentals. So there's no way there's 500,000 in notes. So this guy was pretty full of crap. He had also said that not many second position notes were getting created, which is actually not true because a lot of second position notes were created in that time frame. And then he also had this kind of framework he laid out for making $250K a year in 2017. And so he talked about buying 20 $50,000 unpaid balance notes for 25K each. So he's saying you're going to buy 20 notes at a 50% discount, which granted pricing was lower back then, but even then that's a little tough. You definitely can't do that Now, like there was an assumption that each borrower was going to reinstate and give you like a 5K down payment. I mean, maybe one out of two out of the 20 might do that, but not all of them. That's kind of an insane assumption to make. Um, and then there was also some really bad ROI calculations. He was talking about taking the monthly payment times 12 divided by the purchase price to get the return, which that's not how the math works, folks. That's not how that works at all. Sorry. Oops, sorry about that. My daughter just called me on the phone as I was recording. And then he also had this stair step pricing model for CFDs, which I'm not even going to bother to explain it because the whole thing doesn't really make a lot of sense. Um, some other bad advice that came from someone else who was talking about buying from banks directly. Um, a lot of times when people get started in notes, right? They're like, okay, how do I go and buy these from the bank? And there's very good reasons why everybody figures they'll go there first, right? Because banks originate mortgages, right? The mortgage on your house, you may have gone to a bank to get it. The reality is buying notes directly from banks is very, very challenging. Not impossible. I know people who do it, but not the place to start and not very easy to do. But this particular guy was talking about how, it was relatively straightforward to buy from banks. And then he was saying like you could buy directly from banks and then just easily broker these deals. Um, and that's just not the case. Now, granted, I wasn't as active back then, but I don't think that was the case then. This particular guy did have some stuff though that was proven to be true. And he was talking about just the dangers of some of the brokers that were out there at the time and the middlemen. So this isn't really so much the case now. I don't see very much of this, but 5, 6, 7 years ago, there were a lot of people who would get a hold of a tape and then try to broker it. And then sometimes like they would send that tape out to people trying to sell it. Like they didn't own the assets, right? They're just like, get a tape from the seller, send it out, try to find a buyer, and then play middleman. And then sometimes someone else would get it and do the same thing. And there would actually be these like broker chains that just didn't work. And it would end up wasting a lot of time. So that was definitely true at the time. There's not as many people trying to do that right now. Back to some really good advice that I received. So there's a presentation from Quincy Long from Quest IRA. Quest is where I ended up opening my IRA account, still have it. It's been really good. And he talked about how if you do get an early payoff on a note that you bought at a discount, you get a huge yield. And that's definitely true. I've had a number of notes since then that I bought at some discount where the borrower either sold the property and sold it off or refinanced the loan, or, it was maybe a little lower balance loan that was getting closer to maturity. And I decided just to write a check and pay it off. And so that's definitely proven to be the case. He talked a little bit about seller finance and the importance of using a RMLO or a registered mortgage loan administrator. I've done a number of seller finance deals since then where I used an RMLO. I use Max Bailey at Call the Underwriter for that. Actually, he'll be speaking in the workshop coming up as well. And then there was a lot of information about like prohibited transactions in an IRA, self-directed IRA account. That was all super new to me. I wasn't familiar with it at all. And he talked about staying away from checkbook IRAs. Um, and I think for me at the time, that was definitely good advice. Like for me and my self-directed IRA, even though there's maybe a little bit of friction, because if I'm going to buy an asset or I need to pay a bill, I got to go through Quest, either doing a direction of investment or an expense pay, and there's some fees in that and whatnot. But I kind of like it because it keeps me out of trouble, right? There's, especially when I was starting out and just didn't know the rules, it's a good way to keep from inadvertently breaking one of those IRA rules and, basically destroying your IRA. Now that I'm a little more experienced with it, I'm a little more open to the idea of a checkbook IRA. I've never had one. I don't plan to get one because Quest works fine and dandy for me. And for people who are starting out, I would recommend just going through a normal custodian like Quest or Equity Trust or somebody like that. But if for some reason I was going to create a new account, I'd at least consider that since I'm more familiar with the rules and more comfortable with them. And then there was this performing note panel I listened to. Dave Putz was in this one as well. He was talking about the importance of building a good ROI calculator. That's definitely something I've taken to heart as kind of a spreadsheet guy. It's fairly straightforward for me. But really, what he was getting at here was understanding all of your costs, understanding the risk levels, understanding the money you're going to get back to really get, a solid idea of what your return on investment's going to be before you go into a deal. Some of the discussion around performing note yields was interesting. Wayne Schnell was on this one. He said he was targeting like 12 to 15% returns at the time for himself. And then he was taking on funding partners who were also getting, a share in addition to that as well. So pricing was definitely a little better back there. You could get some really juicy returns on performing notes. They're not as high as that these days. Like in some cases, these guys were talking about upwards to almost like 20% rates of return on performing notes. Nowadays, you can still definitely do 12 pretty easily. And sometimes I do get into that 15% range if there's like a little bit of hair on the deal, but interesting to see the pricing adjustments as well. The other thing that they called out in this one was that, and I bolded this one, is that getting complacent with servicers is a huge mistake. This is definitely proven true where I've had to do a lot of follow-up with loan servicers. I've had to put systems in place and use my CRM pipe drive to set reminders to make sure servicers are doing things they should be doing automatically. Like I've had loan servicers not pay the property taxes when the borrower was escrowing money for taxes. I've had loan servicers fail to send me payments that were received. I've had loan servicers fail to check if there was forced placed insurance and put it on or renew forced placed insurance. It's stuff you shouldn't have to do, but the reality is you kind of do overall. Although I will call out that lately, I've been increasingly using FCI for my loan servicer, and I haven't had to do nearly as much of that kind of stuff as well. So that was pretty good. Excuse me. The other advice this panel had was they said if you're going to kind of dabble in notes and do one or two, then to stay away from non-performing notes. Like don't do non-performing notes unless you're more dedicated to the business. I mostly agree with that. Like if you're not going to do that much in notes, you want to do a little bit. I do think it makes sense to focus on performing notes just because it makes your life, more simple. Non-performing notes have a few more moving parts. There's more stuff to learn. So if you're going to go through that learning curve and know how to do them, it makes more sense if you're going to do more deals, right? If you're going to make that time investment to learn how to do it. But non-performing notes can also be very lucrative. And if you know performing, you've got a big chunk of it. So, if you want to get some experience in non-performing notes, I don't know that dabbling with one or two is the worst thing in the world. The other thing they said that was definitely the case for me is they said you'll learn more from buying your first note than anything else. And that's how it went in my case. So, I did all this learning, all this studying, but there's nothing like actually being in the midst of a deal, reading all the actual paperwork, wiring funds, which is always nervy the first time you do that, getting the actual hard collateral file and all that good stuff. So, I definitely always recommend people get trained, do their homework, get educated before you start putting money into these things so you don't make a mistake. There's a trade-off between that and getting in the game and doing your first note because you're going to get so many learnings from that that are going to serve you. I know for me, after I bought my first performing note, it kind of took me a little while. I was nervous. I wasn't 100% sure what I was doing. I was asking a lot of questions. But once I got through that, I was pretty shortly off to the races. Um, and then there was, okay, so here's some more bad advice. We'll call this guy, I'll call him bad actor number two. Um, Although he did have some good advice in here as well. He said kind of this was a different discussion, but he said a similar comment. We said the first transaction is scary, but then it's wash, rinse, repeat after that. And that part's actually true. The other thing he said that was true is that if you have a property that catches on fire, that because, assuming you have it under insurance, you can make really big returns. And unfortunately, I learned that one the other year as well, where I had a property that burned down. Borrower had insurance, so then my loan got paid off in full. I had bought it at a discount, and so I collected that difference. So it's horrible that someone's house gets burnt down, but it can be a windfall to the lender if they bought the loan at a discount. So I've only had one do that. I also had the kitchen fire in Jackson, Mississippi, although that didn't burn down the whole house. But I know a lot of other note investors who have had fires as well. It seems like house fires are way more prevalent than I had quite realized before I got into this business. What else? Okay, so into a talk from Wayne Snow, one of the guys that I followed really closely. He's kind of moved on to other stuff and basically kind of retired a little bit from notes, but this guy has done like 400 note deals. Super sharp guy. Always like following Wayne because he had kind of a similar background to me doing marketing in the tech business before going whole hog into notes. He said his top states were Ohio, Tennessee, Florida, Indiana, and Georgia. For me, Ohio and Indiana are definitely two of the states I've done the most in, that and Michigan. I'm not sure why he didn't list Michigan there. He had Tennessee. I've done a little bit in Tennessee, although I've had really good experiences. That's one of my favorite states. Florida, where I grew up, I haven't done too much of for no particular reason. And then Georgia, I've done just a little bit in my self-directed IRA, although I bought another note now and I'm getting licensed in the state. One of the reasons I shied away from Georgia was just because of the licensing requirement, but now I'm getting that so I can buy there. Some other great advice that Wayne had was talked about surrounding yourself with smarter people and how important that is. That's definitely true, right? You don't want to be the smartest guy or gal in the room or you're not learning as much. And then he also talked about 6 success factors that were really good. So he talked about the importance of defining your processes, something that I definitely took to heart and kind of always did. Anyways, he talked about building a core team. So he had his partner that he was working with that handled a lot of the due diligence. He did a little more of the capital raising and working with vendors. And I think he had like an intern or something like that. I haven't taken it to quite the degree maybe that he described, but obviously, as I've talked about many times, I lean on Karen heavily for a lot of the management of my portfolio. And then there were some other things on systems. He talked about, like, Adam Adams was another guy that I followed who was really good at systems. Adams actually retired to Ecuador, I believe now. That's the other interesting thing going through my notes on this stuff. Some of these guys who were hard at it kind of won the game and are retired now, which is pretty motivating. But Adam had a series of videos on how to use Pipedrive to organize a notes portfolio. And I followed that and actually still use Pipedrive to this day. I modified it heavily. I kind of built my own little method, but I had started with his and it was a really good starting point. And then in this one too, they also talked about the importance of a good ROI calculator. It's kind of incredible how many people do things a little bit by the seat of their pants, or I know financial calculators are still extremely popular, but the advantage of building a spreadsheet, building your own ROI calculator is you can make sure you do the same thing every time and can save the results, right? So you can go back and look at things or do a save as when you have the new deal. It's just faster and it's going to save you a lot of time, and your process is going to be more accurate and more consistent. They also did a lot of talking about marketing and capital raising, which I got big into as well. I know around this time when people talked about capital raising, I found that very intimidating, and that seemed kind of almost impossible and really hard. That was one of those things that I found to be way more straightforward than I would have expected going on. And then as we got towards the end of 2017, I had gone down this rabbit hole and I was like, okay, I'm ready to start buying stuff. I want to get involved, but I want to meet some of these folks face to face before I do it. And Note Expo 2017 was my big opportunity to do that. It's a great show. If you haven't done it, I highly recommend it. I was just here this past November in 2023, but I had a list of people that I wanted to go and meet. Cody Cox, who I'm very close with now, he's going to be in the workshop as well. Wayne, who I ended up buying stuff with. Bad actor number one from earlier in the podcast, who I did not see. Dave Putz, who's going to be in the workshop. And then there was Chase Thompson and Robbie Woods, who used to have the NBA podcast. They're kind of out of the game these days, but that was like one of those early, at the time, maybe just about the only podcast around. There wasn't too much beyond that, but I found that very motivating and learned a lot from that as well. And then there was Kim Banks Fawcett and Adam Adams, who are really great folks. A little bit more advice that I found. This came from Martin Sands. And he said to use attorneys who offer a la carte pricing and don't just do a retainer. It's kind of a subtle point, but it's really true. If you ever are working with a new attorney and they want you to pay some big retainer, they're usually going to end up being overpriced. Like good foreclosure attorneys should be able to give you an idea of what the costs are going to be up front. There's generally a Fannie Mae schedule they use for every state. And so, yeah, your attorney pricing should always be kind of straightforward and a la carte. If they want something else, it kind of indicates that maybe notes are not their specialty. And so they're going outside their lane. And so they're going to charge you to go outside your lane. So I would take away from that. Some of the takeaways I had from the Note Expo conference was that I was considering joint venturing with someone else. And I decided if I was going to do that, I should do it on a non-performing note. And then when I bought, I would start with a performing note. And that's actually what I did. So my first two deals that I did at the end of the year, one was a joint venture with somebody else on a non-performing note. And then I bought a performing note at it's like December 27th or so. It was like the tail end of the year, like between Christmas and New Year's. And the joint venture worked out real well. The borrower ended up selling the property and paying off the loan. So it was actually a pretty quick turn for a non-performing note and a good result. So that left a good taste. Now, this particular JV partner, they were good at executing the deal. They were not good at communication. Like this guy would go dark for weeks at a time, which was scaring the heck out of me. At the end of the day, he came through, but it was not a great experience. And so that really did a lot of informing of my processes for working with investors. If an investor asks me a question and it's taken 2 weeks to get back, I'm probably dead somewhere, right? Something's gone horribly wrong if that happens. And then the performing note that I bought at the end of the year, I actually still hold in my self-directed IRA, and it's done pretty well. Actually, just the other day, there was they weren't paying the trash bill or something, and I got this intent to lean from the city. So I've had a few little odds and ends to deal with, but that loan is basically paid reliably for, whatever that's been, over 6 years now. I did a lot of looking at loan servicers, and was kind of settling on FCI. And it's just funny because I said, well, I had some notes that I would look at either like FCI or maybe Allied or Madison. I actually use all three of those right now. And I listed out some of my goals after Note Expo. So I wanted to start investing in my self-directed IRA, which I had set up but not invested yet. I've definitely done that. And I was just targeting 10% returns in the self-directed IRA. Because my idea with that was always to buy, even though you can get higher returns and you could definitely get higher returns at the time, I was kind of just looking for safety and just looking for some steady as you go cash flowing notes. So I didn't have to do a whole lot with those. And so a lot of the stuff I bought in the self-directed IRA since has higher returns, but I've definitely hit that. And then also had a goal for 2018 to start taking outside money from investors and get the first outside investor, which I actually did. I actually got several by the end of 2018. And then there were some other talks from Eddie Speed, and part of his keynote. That was really fascinating. He talked about his, 40 whatever years in the note industry and some of the different cycles that have come and gone in notes, going all the way back to the early 80s. Bob Repass, who's obviously still around, had a really good talk on his 4 I's: integrity, intelligence, initiative, and intensity. And he also made a comment about working on a book. Although I looked on Amazon, I haven't seen a book come out from him yet, so I might have to call him out on that one. And then there was another really good talk on using IRAs in kind of creative ways from Walter Woodford, who actually just had a phone call with the other day and know him a little bit. Another, great guy with a lot of really terrific advice. So definitely suggest following his stuff as well. Yeah. So how did it all turn out at the end? Well, like I said, I did that joint venture at the end of 2017, bought my first performing note. And then in 2018, I went off to the races. I think I bought at least 15 notes that year, started taking on outside funding, and kind of scaled from there. So I hope that provides some good info for you. Maybe some good motivation. Like if you're in that point I was, where you're just kind of figuring things out, that it's very realistic that a year from now you could be doing a lot of deals, taking on outside funding. Like if you're really dedicated to this and you're, doing your homework and doing things methodically, and you kind of keep moving one step at a time, you can make progress. It's definitely not an overnight thing, but you can make where you can get to, say, a year from now, or definitely 2 years from now. It's probably a lot further than you would realize. So hope that helps you out. And again, if you're interested in the virtual workshop, like if you really want to start accelerating on that journey, I did a couple of virtual workshops in that same time frame. That's actually where some of these talks that I referenced were from. You can get the early bird pricing until the end of the month for $299. And then the other thing you get with that as well is a $399 credit if you're ever interested in the Note Launchpad course. So if you were thinking about doing Note Launchpad and really going whole hog, you can essentially get the workshop for free. And then I'm also doing free one-on-one strategy calls to help people get started for everyone who signs up for the workshop. So hopefully you can do that. And, you'll get to the point in a few years where you're looking back on it like me after doing 100+ notes and reminiscing about all the interesting learnings. All right. So take care, and I will see you next time.